Design may include features that are complex enough to be separate components, or that are reusable across our views. Welcome back to Angular 2 Getting Started from Pluralsight. My name is Deborah Kurata, and in this module we see how to build components designed to be nested within other components. And we'll discover how to establish communication between the nested component and its container. Just like nesting dolls, we can nest our components. We can nest a component within another component, and nest that component within yet another component, and so on. And because each component is fully encapsulated, we expose specific inputs and outputs for communication between a nested component and its container, allowing them to pass data back and forth. There are two ways to use a component and display the component's template. We can use a component as a directive. We saw how to use a component as a directive when we displayed the app component template in the index.html file. The mhapp directive is defined as the app component selector. The template is then displayed within the directive tags. We use this same technique with nested components. Alternatively, we can use a component as a routing target, so it appears to the user that they've traveled to another view. The template is then displayed in a full page style view. We'll use this technique later in this course to route to our product list view. Our product list view is currently used as a directive, but that's only because we have not yet covered routing. In this course module, we'll focus on building a nested component. So what makes a component nestable? Technically speaking, any of our components could be nested if they have a selector defined in the component decorator. But does it really make sense to nest a large view, such as our product list? For our purposes, we'll define a component as nestable if its template only manages a fragment of a larger view, if it has a selector so it can be used as a directive, and optionally, if it communicates with its container. In this module, we'll build a nested component. Then we'll review how to use that nested component as a directive in a container component. We'll examine how to pass data to the nested component using a property with the input decorator, and how to pass data out of the nested component by raising an event defined with the output decorator. In our sample application, to improve the user experience, we want to replace the rating number displayed in the product list component with stars. In this module, we'll build this star component and nest it within the product list component. Let's get started. Here is a visual representation of a component that is nestable. Here is another component. It wants to use the nestable component in its template. We then refer to the outer component as the container or parent component, and we refer to the inner component as the nested or child component. When building an interactive application, the nested component often needs to communicate with its container. The nested component receives information from its container using input properties, and the nested component outputs information back to its container by raising events. In our sample application, we want to change the display of the 5-star rating from this to this. Displaying the rating number using a visual representation, such as stars, makes it quicker and easier for the user to interpret the meaning of the number. This is the nested component we'll build in this module. For the star component to display the correct number of stars, the container must provide the rating number to our star component as an input. And if the user clicks on the stars, we want to raise an event to notify the container. Let's jump right in and build our star component. When we last saw our sample application, we had completed the product list component. Now, of course, we want to change it. Instead of displaying a number for the rating here, we want to display stars. Instead of adding the code to the product list component to display the stars, we want to build it as a separate component. This keeps the template and logic for that feature encapsulated and makes it reusable. So let's begin by creating a star component. The star component can be used by any feature of the application, so it really doesn't belong in our products folder. We'll instead put it in a shared folder where we'll put all our shared components. If you are using the starter files, I've already created this folder and included the template and style sheet for our component here. Now we are ready to build the star component. We begin by creating a new file. We'll name it star.component.ts. We then create this component just like we'd create any other component, starting with the class. Export, class, star component. What's next? Yep, we decorate the class with the component decorator. Recall that it is this component decorator that makes this class a component. As always, it shows us a syntax error here because we are missing, yep, our import. Now we are ready to set the component decorator properties. For the selector, we don't want to use the PM prefix because this component could be reused anywhere in our company, not just in the product management application. We'll instead prefix the selector with an abbreviation for our company, which in this case is AI for Acme Inc. For the template URL, we provide the path to the HTML file provided in the starter files. We add the style URLs property, and in the array, we'll set the first element to the path of the style sheet that was also provided. Now let's take a peek at the star component template. Here it displays 5 stars. It then crops the stars based on a defined width. This technique can then display partial stars, such as 4.5 of the 5 stars, by setting the width such that only 4.5 of the stars appear. Recall what this syntax is called? This is property binding. We're using it here to set the style width, and here to bind the title property to display the numeric rating value. For these bindings to work, we need 2 properties in the components class, the rating and the star width. Let's add these 2 properties. We want a rating property, which is a number and defines the rating value. Since we don't yet have a way to get this value, let's hard-code it to 4 for now, so we'll see some stars. And we need the star width. This value is calculated based on the rating. So where do we put that calculation? Well, we'd want the star width recalculated anytime the container changed the rating number. So let's tap into the onChanges lifecycle hook as we discussed in the last module. We'll add onChanges to the import statement. We'll implement the onChanges interface, and we'll write code for the ng onChanges method identified in the onChanges interface. In this method, we'll convert the rating number to a star width based on the width of our stars. Our component is now complete, and we're ready to nest it in another component. How do we do that? Now we are ready to nest our new component within another component. We do that by using our nested component as a directive and following the same steps we covered earlier in this course. Here is a shortened form of the code for a container component and its template. And here is the nested component we just created. Instead of displaying the star rating number, we want to display the stars. So the container component uses the nested component by specifying its directive here. This identifies where in the container to place the nested component's template. As we've seen in prior demos, when we use a component as a directive, we need to tell Angular how to find that directive. We do that by declaring the nested component in an Angular module. How do we know which Angular module? Well, we still only have one Angular module, app module, but if we had multiple modules, we'd add it to each Angular module that declares a component that uses the directive. In our example, the product list components template wants to use the star component, so we add the declaration to the same Angular module that declares the product list component. We define the nested component in the declarations array of the ng module decorator, and as always, define what we need by adding an import statement. Let's jump right back to our demo. Our star component is now shown here on the right. We want to use our star component in the product list template that is here on the left. In the table data element, we want to replace the display of the star rating number with our star component. To do that, we simply replace the binding with our AI star directive. Now our product list template will display our stars here. Next, we need to tell Angular where to find this directive. Since we only have one Angular module, we'll add the declaration for the nested component there. Because we know by now that we'll need it, we'll add the import for the star component first. Then we add the star component to the declarations array passed into the ng module decorator. And since we imported the component first, IntelliSense helps us here. These are the same steps we followed earlier in this course to use a component as a directive. Nothing new here so far. Let's see what we did. We have stars, yes! But we see 5 of them. Let's clear out the filter. Yes, we see 5 every time. Hover over the stars, and we see our hard-coded star rating is 4. It seems that our star width is not being set. Let's look at the code again. We set the star width property in the ng onChanges method when the onChanges lifecycle event occurs. But the onChanges lifecycle event never occurs because onChanges only watches for changes to input properties. We don't have any input properties. So we have 2 problems here. Our onChanges event does not fire, and we don't currently have a way to get the correct rating number from the container. Let's see how input properties can solve both of these issues. If a nested component wants to receive input from its container, it must expose a property to that container. The nested component exposes a property it can use to receive input from its container using the aptly named input decorator. We use the input decorator to decorate any property in the nested components class. This works with any property type, including an object. In this example, we want the rating number passed into the nested component, so we mark that property with the input decorator. The container component then passes data to the nested component by setting this property with property binding. When using property binding, we enclose the binding target in square brackets. We set the binding source to the data that the container wants to pass to the nested component. In this example, the product list template passes the product's star rating number. The only time we can specify a nested component's property as a property binding target on the left side of an equals is when that property is decorated with the input decorator. So in this example, the product list template can bind to the rating, but not the star width. Let's give this a try. Going back to our star component, let's add input to our import statement, because we know we're going to need it. The star component wants to expose the rating property to its container, so the container can provide the rating number. We'll add the input decorator then to the rating property. The input decorator is a function, so we add parentheses. We don't need to pass anything to this function, so that's it. And let's remove this default value. Now that we can get the value from the container, we don't need that here. In our example, we decorate only one property of the nested component with the input decorator, but we are not limited to one. We can expose multiple input properties as needed. In the containers template, we use property binding and define the nested component's input property as the target of the binding. Then we set the binding source to the value we want to pass into the nested component. In this example, we pass the product's star rating. That's it. The product star rating property is now bound to the rating input property of the nested component. Anytime the container data changes, the onChanges lifecycle event is generated and the star width is recalculated. The appropriate number of stars are then displayed. Let's check it out in the browser. That looks better. Well, we're not really displaying the 0.2 stars here. Our algorithm could use some improvement, but you get the idea. But what if we want to send data back from our nested component to our container? Let's look at that next. We just saw how the container passes data to the nested component by binding to a nested component property that is decorated with the input decorator. If the nested component wants to send information back to its container, it can raise an event. The nested component exposes an event it can use to pass output to its container using the aptly named output decorator. We can use the output decorator to decorate any property of the nested components class. However, the property type must be an event. The only way a nested component can pass data back to its container is with an event. The data to pass becomes the event payload. In Angular, an event is defined with an event emitter object. So here we create a new instance of an event emitter. Notice the syntax here. TypeScript supports generics. If you are not familiar with generics, this syntax allows us to identify a specific type that the object instance will work with. When creating an event emitter, the generic argument identifies the type of the event payload. If we want to pass a string value to the container in the event payload, we define string here. If we want to pass an integer, we define number here. If we want to pass multiple values, we can specify an object here. In this example, we define a notify event with a string payload. When the user clicks on the stars, the star component receives that click event. We use event binding in the star component template to call the star component's onClick method. In the onClick method, we use the notify event property and call its emit method to raise the notify event to the container. If we want to pass data in the event payload, we pass that data into the emit method. In this example, the onClick method raises the notify event and sets the event payload to a string message. The container component receives that event with the specified payload. In the container components template, we use event binding to bind to this notify event and call a method. We access the event payload using $event. The only time we can specify a nested components property as an event binding target on the left side of an equals is when that property is decorated with the output decorator. Lastly, the container component provides the method to execute when the notify event occurs. Since the event payload is a string, this function takes in a string. Here we can perform any desired action. Lots of moving parts here. Let's jump into the code and try it out. We are back in the sample application looking at the star component. We'll add output and event emitter to our import statement because we know we're going to need them. We want to expose an event to the container, so let's define a rating clicked event property. We define the type of this property to be event emitter, and we want the event payload to be a string, so we specify string as the generic argument. We set the rating click property to a new instance of event emitter. We decorate this property with the output decorator to expose it so that the container can respond to this event. The output decorator is a function, so we add parentheses. In this example, we are decorating only one property of the nested component with the output decorator, but we are not limited to one. We can expose multiple output properties as needed. Moving to the template, we use event binding to bind the div elements click event to a local onClick method. Then let's implement this onClick method in the component. When the star component processes the click event on the div, it wants to raise an event to the container and pass along a message. We use the event property and call its emit method, passing in the desired string. In this example, we use the ES2015 backticks to define a template string. This allows us to embed the rating directly into this string using $syntax. Our star component is then complete. Now let's respond to this event in our container. The product list component wants to listen for this rating clicked event, so let's update the product list template. Here, in the Nested Components directive, we'll add event binding to respond to the rating click event exposed by the star component, and we'll get the event payload. We respond by calling our own local method. We'll call it onRatingClicked. The event payload is available using $event, so we pass that in to the onRatingClicked method. We then need to write code for this new method in the containers class. In the product list component, we define the onRatingClicked method. We'll add it on the bottom with our other methods. We define a message string parameter for the event payload. To keep things simple, we'll just modify the page title to display product list and the message from the nested component. Okay, yeah, that is not a very real-world example, but I wanted to keep this as straightforward as possible. We'd have a better example if the nested component contained an input box, and we could pass the user's input in the event payload. But you get the general idea here. Let's see how this works in the browser. We'll clear the filter by, click on the star rating, and we see the page title change to display the message received from the nested component. Success! We just saw how the container passes data to the nested component by binding to a nested component property that is decorated with the input decorator, and how the nested component uses an event property decorated with the output decorator to raise events. We can think of the properties decorated with the input or output decorators as the public API of the nestable component. Everything else in the component is encapsulated and only accessible to the component's template and class. Let's finish up this module with some checklists we can use as we build nestable components. We build a nested component using the same techniques we use to build any other Angular component. We won't review that again here. Let's instead lay out a checklist for inputs and outputs. Decorate a nested component property with the input decorator anytime it needs input data from its container. Any type of component property can be decorated with the input decorator. Don't forget the prefix, and since the input decorator is a function, follow it with open and closing parentheses. Decorate a nested component property with the output decorator anytime it needs to raise events and optionally pass information back to its container. Only properties of type event emitter should be marked with the output decorator. Use the event emitter's generic argument to specify the type of the event payload. And use the new keyword to create an instance of the event emitter. Don't forget the prefix, and since the output decorator is a function, suffix it with open and closing parentheses. In a container components template, use the nested component as a directive. For the name of the directive, see the nested component's selector property. Use property binding to pass data to the nested component. Any property of the nested component that is decorated with the input decorator can be used as a binding target. Use event binding to respond to events from the nested component. Any event that is decorated with the output decorator can be used as the binding target. And use $event to access the event payload passed from the nested component. This module was all about nested components. We began by building a component that could be nested within other components. We then walked through how to use the nested component within a container. We saw how to pass data into the nested component by binding to a property marked with the input decorator. And we discovered how to pass data out of the nested component by raising an event marked with the output decorator. In this module, we built the star component and nested it within the product list component. We can reuse this component in any other component of the application, such as the product detail component. Next up, let's check out how to build an Angular service so we won't need hard-coded product data in our component.